This lesson is on the female reproductive system, and I'll follow this one up by a more detailed lesson, which will be on the female's reproductive cycles. We'll start off by taking a look at the major macroscopic structures that you do need to be aware of with the female reproductive system. Those structures, if we take a look at the diagram here, and for starters, maybe just to orient ourselves in terms of the different regions of the body, this here is going to be the back of the body that we're taking a look at here. This is the front over at the right hand side. Urinary bladder and the urethra structure is not directly related to, but in close contact with the structures of the female reproductive system. So the ones that you do need to know about, the important structures for the female reproductive system, I'll start by pointing out the ovaries that we have, one on either side of the abdominal cavity. The oviduct, also referred to as the fallopian tubes, one associated with each of the two ovaries. The uterus, also referred to as the womb. Cervix, which is a barrier between the uterus and the vagina or the birth canal. Structures at the lower right hand side really don't need to be concerned about these as far as biology 30 goes, the external genitalia. And we'll just take a look at another picture here showing these same structures, just a different view. This one taking a look at the female reproductive system from the front. So if we start or go in the reverse order of what I did just talk about on the previous slide, vagina, where intercourse is taking place, and if it does take place, sperm will be deposited into the vagina. And I mentioned before that is also the birth canal where the baby is delivered. Cervix is the barrier that we find separating the vagina from the uterus. We can also see in this picture here that it does talk about two different parts of the uterus. There is the uterine wall itself, and the uterine wall is a muscular structure, and the inner lining of the uterus is referred to as the endometrium or the endometrial lining, and that's just what I'm shading here in green. So red is going to be the thick muscle of the uterus, and green is going to be the endometrial lining. Very, very rich blood supply, and when a female is menstruating, it is the endometrial lining that is going to be shed off, and what is shed off are blood vessels, cells, and mucus, and that is dispelled out through the vagina. Now we can see, looking front on here, that from the uterus we do have fallopian tubes or the oviducts that are going to be branching off to either side. The one on the right hand side, we can see that it's cut into the oviduct or fallopian tube, and it is a fairly large tube in diameter, a few millimeters in diameter. If we do follow the fallopian tube to the other end, the end that is away from the uterus, in contact with the uterus, we can see that we have this region that is in close association with another structure that you need to know, mentioned on the previous slide, and that is going to be the ovaries. So we'll see the ovaries, they're the analogous structures to the testes that we talked about with the male reproductive system. In the testes, of course, that is the site of production of the male gametes, the sperm, and also the site of hormone production, the male hormone testosterone. In the case of the ovaries, they are producing the female gametes, which are the eggs, and they are also producing the two female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. If we do take a look at the end of the fallopian tube that is closest to the ovaries, this region right here, they are described as finger-like projections, and it looks like finger-like projections. These are called the fimbriae. Whereas the connection point between the fallopian tubes and the uterus, there is a tight connection point there. There is not a tight connection between the fimbriae and between the ovary. So as we'll see, what is going to happen is the outer region of the ovary is going to burst. It's going to release an egg, and the idea is that egg does need to be drawn into the fallopian tube, and that is the function of the fimbriae. They are going to draw the egg up into the fallopian tube, and where I've drawn this arrow here, if intercourse has taken place and sperm are traveling up in the opposite direction, usually where the sperm and the eggs do meet is somewhere right around where I did draw that arrow. So very important, of course, that the egg is drawn into the fallopian tube once it is released from the ovary. And again, that is the function of those finger-like projections or the fimbriae. This is taking a look at the female reproductive system in a dissected specimen. So again, if we just kind of point out some of the structures that we can see here, this is going to be one of the ovaries. This is the other ovary that we see here. The fallopian tubes. This is one of the fallopian tubes. The other one that we can see here. Right in the center is where we would have the uterus. Cervix probably somewhere around this region. And then the vagina we would find down below that. I'll also point out here that this structure that we see right here and right here, this is not a tube. It is simply connective tissue that's holding the ovaries in place, and in this case connecting them to the outer part of the uterus. And we can also kind of see in this picture here, if we look at this region where we do have the ovary end of the fallopian tube, and it isn't a tight connection between the fallopian tube and the ovary. And again, that's the idea behind having those fimbriae in order to draw the egg into the fallopian tube. So for the reproductive cycles in females, unlike the male, it really doesn't have a cycle in terms of the hormonal changes that are taking place in a male. In females, though, we do have secretion of hormones, and we're going to talk about some of the same hormones that we did talk about with the male reproductive system. Those are FSH and LH, and now we'll talk in more detail about what the actual names stand for and how they do relate to the female reproductive system. And also the two female sex hormones, although they are also produced in males. The two sex hormones are estrogen and progesterone. So the secretion of those four hormones, FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone, are going to be regulating the reproductive cycles that we do have in females. So two different cycles that we are going to be discussing at the same time. One of the cycles are the events that are taking place in the uterus, and for that reason it is referred to as the uterine cycle. It is the endometrial lining, as I mentioned before, that is shed off, and that is called menstruation. So this one is sometimes simply referred to as the menstrual cycle. The other events are taking place in the ovaries, and for that reason are referred to as the ovarian cycle. Collectively, we'll call them the reproductive cycles, and in some cases you may also hear the two of them referred to collectively also as the menstrual cycle, even though once again the menstruation is really dealing with the events that are taking place in the uterus. This picture here is showing a cross-section through one of the ovaries. At the upper right-hand side, that is the connective tissue. That's not the fallopian tube that it's showing there. In fact, the fallopian tube would hopefully be somewhere down around the lower left-hand side, because that is the point where the egg is being released out of the ovary. So this single picture that we're taking a look at here in reality is not something that you would see in one of the ovaries if you were to slice into it. What this picture is trying to show is all of the events that are taking place throughout the 28-day. We use 28-day as the average length of the female's reproductive cycles. So in terms of this picture here, what it has labeled as number 1, we will talk about as the beginning of the cycle, and number 6 as the end of the cycle. The event that's taking place at the halfway point, this is at about day 14. That is when the egg is released out of the ovary, and that is the event that is referred to as ovulation, and that is really the point of the events that are taking place inside of the ovary. So egg is released, and we're going to have some hormones that are produced here as well. So if we begin our discussion with number 1, when a female is an embryo, and we'll see this in a few slides here, the female is producing a whole bunch of primary oocytes. Those primary oocytes are produced when the female is an embryo, and that is all of the primary oocytes that that female, in fact, will ever have. So once a female does reach her reproductive years, beginning between the ages of about 11 and 15 or so on average, what is going to happen is those remaining primary oocytes at that age, and I say remaining because a lot of them have died over the previous decade, from the point when the female was born until she reaches puberty, at the beginning of each cycle, several of these primary oocytes. So what that number is, well, it's going to vary. Maybe it's 10, maybe it's 20 of these that are going to begin to mature at the start of each ovarian cycle. So what's going to happen with these is they are going to enlarge. But what is really enlarging is not the egg on the inside. The egg on the inside is not dividing. It's always going to be one single egg that we do have on the inside. What is dividing and what is getting bigger is the follicle. So the follicle is made up of follicular cells. They are going to be dividing very, very rapidly. As these cells are produced, what they are going to be doing, in addition to supporting the egg, the oocyte on the inside of the follicle, so they will be supporting that egg, but they're also going to be spitting out a whole bunch of the female sex hormone estrogen. The bigger the follicle, the more estrogen there is going to be produced. Out of the 10 or 20 that begin to develop at the start of the ovarian cycle, what usually happens in humans is that by the time it reaches the stage of the mature follicle, the one that is growing the fastest, the one that is the largest, is going to send out inhibitory signals to all of the other ones, and they are going to end up degenerating, not just in that one ovary, but in the other ovary as well. So it's usually just one of these mature follicles that is going to last by the time we reach about the halfway point in the ovarian cycle. So the bigger the follicles get, the more estrogen is produced. The bigger the follicles, the more support there is going to be and nourishment provided for that single egg on the inside. Halfway point through the ovarian cycle, that is when the egg is going to be released. So we're talking about the surface of the ovary. It is going to rupture, and we're going to have, and again, I'm just calling it an egg in a general term, but we can refer to at this point as the secondary oocyte. After it is released, those fimbriae at the ovarian end of the fallopian tube should draw it into the fallopian tube. What remains behind are still a whole bunch of follicular cells. There will be some that are lost along the way, and we can kind of see that in the picture here. So as those follicular cells are lost, the amount of estrogen that is produced is going to go down. So we will have an increase in, I'll just put EST for estrogen. This is only going to be temporary though, because those remaining follicular cells, they're going to be transformed into a very important structure referred to as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to be spitting out female reproductive hormones, and in this case it's not just the estrogen, but it is the progesterone as well. So we're going to have an increase in estrogen and an increase in progesterone. Kind of similar to the follicle. As it gets bigger and bigger, there are going to be more of these hormones that are produced. If that egg that was released and drawn into the fallopian tube is not fertilized, what's going to happen is the corpus luteum is going to degenerate after about a week to 10 days. So as it does degenerate, decrease in size, means we're going to see a decrease in the production of those same two hormones, estrogen and progesterone. When that does happen, that's going to take us back to the beginning of the cycle again. So again, from beginning to end, on average, this is about 28 days. That is the time frame that we are going to use for the reproductive cycle events that are taking place both in the ovary that we see here and also in the uterus. This one's a little bit more accurate in terms of where we would see these events taking place. I mentioned that we wouldn't see all of those structures at the same time, and certainly you wouldn't see these different structures migrating around the ovary in a counterclockwise or clockwise direction or any other particular direction. All of the events are really taking place, well, in this picture here, at this one location. So right at this point is where we have one of the follicles that's getting bigger and bigger. It's at that point where we're going to have ovulation take place, at that point where the corpus luteum is going to form, and eventually where it is going to degenerate. The structure, the corpus luteum, can actually be seen on the surface of the ovary after it has been released, and this in fact is what we see in this picture here. Yellowish structure. Again, it's going to be producing those two hormones, estrogen and progesterone. That is the function of the corpus luteum. Next couple of slides are taking a look at the process of egg formation in the female, and again some distinct similarities to what is taking place in the male with the formation of sperm. In the case of the male, it is spermatogenesis. In the case of the female, it is referred to as oogenesis. So again, some similarities, some differences. It is still meiosis that we are talking about, one duplication of the chromosomes and two divisions resulting in haploid sex cells or gametes that are being produced, ones that have half the normal number of chromosomes compared to the adult cells. One of the distinguishing features that we do see here, though, is we have this horizontal line that's talking about events taking place before birth. In other words, when the female is an embryo, and what is taking place from the point that that female reaches puberty or adolescence until something referred to as menopause. So before the female is ever born, she is producing and will have all of the primary oocytes that she will ever have. So it will be several million of these that are produced early on in embryonic development. Even by the time the female is born, many of them will have died. And by the time the female reaches adolescence or puberty, it's usually down to about 2 to 400,000 of these that do remain. And then each month, we're going to have several of these that are going to begin to mature. Again, somewhere between 10 and 20 of them that will begin to mature. They will continue on with meiotic division, forming a secondary oocyte. But what we see here is with our first meiotic division, we do go from haploid, 2 copies of each chromosome, diploid to haploid, 1 copy of each chromosome, as we form these secondary oocytes. But what this picture shows is that we have unequal division of the cytoplasm. Both this one that I put the check mark beside and this one here that I am circling, they get the same number of chromosomes. So if we are talking about human gametes, it's going to be 23 chromosomes in the yellow one and 23 chromosomes in the purple one. That is the same, but what is not the same is the size of them. The bigger one really gets all of the nutrients that are able to support the growth and development of that oocyte, and the other one gets, well, virtually nothing. And as we can see here, what is going to happen is that it's going to eventually die. That other one that has survived, it is going to be drawn into the fallopian tube, and if it is fertilized, that is what is going to induce the second meiotic division. So when we do have that second meiotic division, again, it's unequal division that we do have. This is the one that's going to survive. This is the one here that is in fact going to die. So unlike with the sperm, where every one of the primary oocytes is going to lead to the formation of 4 sperm, each one possibly capable of fertilizing an egg, in this case only one ends up being capable of fertilizing an egg. But still the number that is produced, number of haploid cells produced from each primary oocyte is going to be 4. So where did those 4 come from? Well, this one at the top here, it may in fact divide again, even though they're not going to survive, to give us 2 here. So that's 1, 2. And then when we take a look at the second meiotic division at the bottom, we have this one here, the third one that's going to die, and then the one that I'm labeling as the fourth one is the one that is going to possibly survive and continue on. It will form the zygote, and if it is implanted into the female's uterus, continue on through embryonic development. Picture on the right-hand side is just showing the similar development that's taking place in the follicle. Again, it is going to be the follicle that is surrounding the egg that we do see on the left-hand side. This slide here, very, very similar, same events really that are taking place in the box. We do have the embryonic development. A couple of additional points that are pointed out here, and a couple of others that I've just added to the side. Some, oops, sorry, I don't have it on this one here. Just some numbers that I had mentioned before, that in terms of these ones here, at birth, It's somewhere between probably 1 to 3 million of these. Ones that are formed early on, it's more like about 7 to 8, but then a bunch of them do die even by the time the female is born. When the female does reach the stage where she's going to be forming the secondary oocytes, now we went from 7 to 8 million to 1 to 3 million, and now we're down to, I'll put the number of about 300,000. Again, this is really going to be sort of a rough estimate, but you can see that the numbers are continually dropping. And finally, I'll finish this introduction off with a little bit of an explanation of the changes that are taking place in terms of the hormones in the female. And very similar again to the male, what we saw with the hypothalamus producing a releasing hormone, gonadotropic releasing hormone. It causes the anterior pituitary to produce the two hormones FSH, which does stand for follicle stimulating hormone. So what does that hormone do? Well, it stimulates the follicles. The other hormone, luteinizing hormone, has to do with the corpus luteum. A little deceiving in this picture here, where this follicle stimulating hormone is really going to act is not on this mature follicle here, but it's really going to be acting over on these ones here, the primary follicles. That, in fact, is when we will see there is the highest concentration of follicle stimulating hormone, which is necessary to stimulate the early development of those follicles. Luteinizing hormone, again, even though the arrow is pointing to the corpus luteum, certainly eventually you do get the corpus luteum that is formed, but really it's the luteinizing hormone that is causing this event here. It is causing ovulation. What's left over, the follicular cells will form or be transformed into the corpus luteum. So I did mention before that it is the follicle cells that are going to producing the estrogen. So all these ones here, the bigger the follicles get, the more estrogen that is going to be produced. And once that egg is released in the process of ovulation, then the corpus luteum is going to be producing both the estrogen and the progesterone. Just like with the male reproductive system, there of course is negative feedback. So when that estrogen is produced, whether it is by the follicular cells or whether it's by the corpus luteum, we are going to have negative feedback upon the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Same case with the progesterone. And of course, if we do have negative feedback, that means that we're going to be decreasing the production of the gonadotropic releasing hormone produced by the hypothalamus and the two ovarian hormones FSH, and a decrease in the luteinizing hormone as well. So again, there is much more to come, getting into all the details when we do talk about the female reproductive cycles, and that will be the next lesson.